In 1966, a company that was nearly bankrupt built a diesel engine that made half the transmissions in America obsolete overnight. It didn't make more power than the competition. It made power differently. And in doing so, it killed an entire way of life. This is the story of the Maxidyne. To understand why this engine mattered, you need to understand what driving a big rig was like before it existed, and it was brutal. Picture this. It's 1964. You're behind the wheel of a Class 8 truck, 80,000 pounds gross, rolling down some two-lane highway in Pennsylvania. No air ride seat, just a foam cushion with springs in it that transmits every crack and pothole directly into your spine. No heater worth mentioning, no air conditioning at all. A steering wheel the size of a dinner table because power steering is either non-existent or barely functional. And coming up through the floor, 2 gear shift levers, not 1. 2. The tall one on your left is the auxiliary, a high-low range selector. The short one on your right is your main box, usually 5 speeds. Together they give you 10 forward gears. Some trucks had a 5x3 or a 5x4, giving you 15 or 20 ratios. You need both hands, both feet, and something close to a musician's sense of timing to make this thing work. The engines of that era, your Detroit 671s, your Cummins NHX, they had power bands so narrow you could barely tolerate a 400 RPM drop before the engine just quit pulling. These were naturally aspirated diesels, or early turbos, that hadn't really solved the fundamental problem. Cruising speed sat between 1900 and 2100 revolutions per minute, and if you let it lug below 15 or 1600, you were done. The engine would lose its guts, start stumbling, and you'd feel the whole truck begin to sag. You had to grab another gear, then another, then another. On a long grade, you might run through 10, 13, even 18 gears just to keep the thing moving. Short-haul guys doing local deliveries in hilly country could shift hundreds of times in a single day. Now here's where it gets interesting with the twin-stick setup. You'd start in first gear on the main box, low range on the auxiliary. Rev it up, shift the main into second, then split the auxiliary into high. Back to the main for third, split the auxiliary again. Both hands working the levers, left foot on the clutch, right foot feathering the throttle, all while steering an 18-wheeler down a 2-lane highway. If you missed a split shift, both transmissions could land in neutral at the same time. Drivers called it double nothing. The truck would coast, the engine would scream, and your only option was to stop completely and start over, at highway speed on a grade with 80,000 pounds pushing you forward. That was the reality. Learning a twin stick ended a lot of trucking careers before they started. The coordination required was physical, mental, and rhythmic. Double clutching each shift, feeling the RPMs through the floorboard because your tachometer was an afterthought. These transmissions didn't forgive mistakes. They punished them. And you did this for 10, 12 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, for years. That was trucking in the early 1960s, and most people just accepted that it had to be this way. Why? Because diesel engines had narrow power bands. That was a fact of physics. Everybody knew it, except 2 engineers in Hagerstown, Maryland, who thought everybody was wrong. Here's the thing about Mack Trucks in the mid-1960s. They were dying, not slowly, quickly. From 1959 to 1964, earnings collapsed from $15.8 million to $3.4 million. That's a 78% decline in 5 years. The corporate offices had been moved to Montvale, New Jersey, miles away from the factory floor in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Finance guys were running the show, guys who'd never turned a wrench on a truck in their lives. They deferred maintenance, let the facilities rot, and spent their time squeezing cash flow while the brand decayed underneath them. The Allentown plant was so outdated that trucks were still being spray painted by hand. The workers knew it. Strikes, work stoppages, morale in the gutter. The management style was toxic, firing people on a whim, no promotions from within. The Bulldog brand that had hauled artillery through the mud of World War I and earned its nickname from a British officer who called it the toughest machine he'd ever seen. That brand was becoming a joke. Mack even tried to merge with Chrysler to stay alive, but the Justice Department blocked the deal. By 1964, the board was desperate. They needed someone who actually understood trucks. So they did something desperate. They hired a guy named Zenon Hansen. Hansen was no suit. He'd spent 45 years in the truck business, starting at age 18 in the parts department at International Harvester in Sioux City, Iowa. By 19, the company had put him in its management training program. He spent 7 years working in Europe and Africa, learned French, German, and Italian along the way. Then he left International Harvester after 17 years and built the largest Diamond T truck dealership in the world out in Portland, Oregon. He ran that for 20 years. Then Diamond T got acquired by White Motor Company, and Hansen became White's executive vice president. The man knew trucks. He knew the people who built them, the people who sold them, and the people who drove them. When Mack's board came calling, everyone told him he was crazy to take the job. His response? He said they were giving him a chance to make the Bulldog growl again. Hansen walked into Allentown on January 7, 1965, and did something that nobody expected. He didn't fire anyone, not a single person. He kept the entire team that had been failing and told them they were going to turn this around together. He distributed Bulldog flags, pins, rugs, jewelry, anything to remind people what they were building and where they came from. He moved the corporate offices back to Allentown, right next to the factory. He promoted only from within. He started fixing the maintenance the bean counters had been deferring for years. Built a new world headquarters on Mack Boulevard, initiated plans for a new assembly plant in Macungie, and morale didn't just improve. It caught fire. People started caring again. But Hansen knew that pep talks don't win a market. You need a product. And that's where two engineers enter the story. Walter May was Mack's executive vice president of product and engineering, based at headquarters in Allentown. He'd been watching the industry and saw something that everyone else had apparently accepted as unchangeable. Truck engines had narrow power bands, which meant drivers needed a dozen or more gears. But what if the power band didn't have to be narrow? May authorized a research and development project and handed it to the man who would actually design the thing. Winton Pelizzoni. Pelizzoni was the chief engineer at Mack's powertrain facility in Hagerstown, Maryland. He'd been with the company since 1937, working his way up from the test cells when he was just 24 years old. He'd started as a lab technician, became lab manager by 1942, and was actively involved in developing the Mack diesel that became the Lanova. Then the direct injection Thermodyne, the engine that built Mack's reputation for reliability and economy through the 50s and early 60s. By 1957, he'd advanced to executive engineer in charge of Mack's entire engine design and development program. When the powertrain division moved to Hagerstown in 1961, Pelizzoni went with it as chief engineer. The man held numerous patents, all for internal combustion engines. Colleagues compared him to Thomas Edison, but he was quiet, soft-spoken, modest, the kind of engineer who let the work do the talking. Pelizzoni looked at the problem and saw something elegant. Mack had adopted turbocharging earlier than most of their competitors, which gave them a displacement disadvantage against Cummins, but other advantages nobody had fully exploited. By carefully matching the turbocharger output to the fuel pump delivery settings, you could reshape an engine's entire torque curve, move the peak torque way down in the RPM range, flatten the horsepower curve across a much wider band, give the engine its guts at low speed instead of making the driver chase revs up top. The result was the ENDT 675, 675 cubic inches of turbocharged inline six-cylinder diesel. On paper, It looked unremarkable, 237 horsepower. That was about the same as a Detroit 671 or a Cummins NH. Nobody was going to write home about 237 horses, but the torque curve, that was the revolution. Peak torque hit at 1,200 revolutions per minute, not 1,800, not 2,000, 1,200. The engine had a usable power band from 1,200 to 2,100 revolutions per minute. That's 900 revolutions per minute of operating range. And here's the number that mattered most. The torque rise was 52%. For context, every other diesel engine on the market at the time had a torque rise of about 20%. Today, after decades of development, the industry targets 35% as optimal. In 1966, Mack dropped a 52% torque rise engine on the market. That's not an improvement. That's a different category. What does 52% torque rise mean in practice? It means the engine gets stronger as it slows down. Hit a hill, the RPMs drop, the torque climbs. The engine digs in instead of giving up. The driver doesn't need to reach for another gear because the engine is already doing the work. And that meant something radical for the transmission. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. See, if your engine can operate across a 900 RPM range with a 52% torque rise, you don't need 10 gears. You don't need 13. You don't need a twin stick. You need 5, maybe 6. So Mack built the Maxitorque, the TRL 107 series, 5 forward speeds, 1 reverse. And the engineering was just as clever as the engine, 3 countershafts, equally spaced around the input shaft. This was a completely new architecture for heavy truck transmissions. By splitting the load across 3 shafts instead of 2, they reduced deflection to almost nothing. The main shaft gears didn't even need bushings because they self-centered among the 3 countershafts. The whole thing was housed in a high-strength aluminum case, built in 2 pieces. It was 2/3 the length of competing multi-speed transmissions, lighter, more compact, and it had the highest torque rating in the industry. The combination was devastating. A Maxidyne-powered truck with the 5-speed Maxitorque could run from 36 to 63 miles per hour in a single gear. No shifting. Hit a 6% grade at 50 miles per hour in 5th gear, downshift once to 4th, and crest the top at 25. 1 shift. On a grade that would have had a Detroit-powered truck with a twin stick running through 4 or 5 gears with both hands flying. Jim Windsor, a diesel industry journalist, got to drive a prototype back in '66 with Bob Zalakar, one of Mack's engineers. The truck had the Maxidyne paired to the 5-speed, and the experience was so different from every other Class 8 truck on the road that it must have felt like a prank. 1 lever, 5 gears, and enough low-end pull to move the earth. Now let's talk about what Pelizzoni and his team actually did under the hood, because the engineering is beautiful in its simplicity. The ENDT 675 was a turbocharged direct injection inline-6, 675 cubic inches, which works out to about 11 liters. The bore and stroke were set up to favor torque production at low RPMs, but the real magic was in 2 systems, the fuel delivery and the turbocharger matching. Conventional diesel engines of the era delivered fuel in a way that was optimized for a narrow RPM window. Peak power at governed speed, peak torque not far below. Drop below that window, and the engine fell on its face. Pelizzoni reworked the fuel injection system to deliver meaningful power across the entire operating range. The fuel pump calibration ensured that the engine was never starved at low speed and never overfueled at high speed. He held patents for variable flow rate fuel injection nozzles that gave the engine finer control over combustion than anything else in the industry. Then, the turbo. Early turbo diesel trucks gained altitude performance and some power, but nobody was using the turbocharger as a tuning instrument. Pelizzoni did. By matching the turbo's pressure output to the fuel pump settings at different RPMs, he created a flat horsepower curve from about 1,700 RPMs all the way to 2,100, while simultaneously building a torque mountain that peaked at 1,200. The turbo wasn't just forcing air, it was reshaping the engine's personality. They also had to reinforce the internals. All that low-end torque put stress on parts that conventional engines never worried about. The crankshaft, bearings, and block had to handle sustained loading at RPMs where other engines were barely ticking over. Mack reworked the bottom end to survive the kind of twisting forces that come with producing peak torque at half the usual engine speed. The result was what Mack called a constant horsepower engine. Horsepower didn't peak and fall off. It stayed flat across the operating range. The driver could work anywhere in that 900 RPM window, and the engine would deliver the same output. No sweet spot to chase. No penalty for running at the bottom of the range. Now here's where it gets clever in a completely different way. In 1971, Mack patented the Dynatard engine brake. Unlike the Jacobs engine brake, which was an external add-on made by a third party, the Dynatard was built into the engine, integral. Part of the design from the ground up. It used oil pressure to hold the exhaust valves slightly open during the compression stroke, turning the engine into an air compressor that absorbed energy and slowed the truck without touching the service brakes. Was it as aggressive as a Jake brake on a big Cummins 855? Drivers will tell you no. The Mack's smaller displacement meant less compression braking force, but it was Mack's own design. It worked with the Maxidyne's unique characteristics, and it meant the entire drivetrain, engine, transmission, and engine brake was one integrated system designed by one company. That was rare then. It's rare now. By 1969, Mack extended the Maxidyne concept to a V8, the ENDT 865. Same constant horsepower philosophy, just more of it. 285 to 325 horsepower, single turbocharger instead of the earlier twin setup on the conventional V8s. New Bosch inline injection pump replacing the troublesome distributor-type unit. The V8 Maxidyne went into the R, the F, the DM, the cruise liner, the superliner. It sounded different from anything else on the road. Mack V8s had their own voice, a deep mechanical growl that drivers still talk about. Though the V8 Maxidynes weren't perfect, the constant lugging at low RPMs, which was the whole point of the Maxidyne concept, put extra thermal stress on the heads. Head gasket failures became a known issue on the 865. One well-known Mack dealer from the 70s admitted he was reluctant to sell V8 Maxidynes for exactly that reason, even though the conventional 866 was rock solid. Trade-offs. Then, in 1973, the intercooled inline-6 arrived, the ENDT 676, 285 horsepower, 1,080 foot-pounds of torque. The intercooler dropped intake air temperatures, allowing more fuel and more power without cooking the engine. This became the workhorse. Dump trucks, cement mixers, over-the-road haulers. The 676 paired to a Maxitorque was the combination that dominated vocational trucking for a generation. So what happened? What happened to the rest of the industry when one company in Allentown rewrote the rules? Cummins watched Mack eating their lunch and responded with their own high-torque rise program. They called it custom torque. Same idea. Wider power band, fewer gears required. But they were playing catch-up. Mack had set the template, and the entire diesel engine industry was now chasing the concept that Pelizzoni had pioneered. Detroit Diesel, Caterpillar, everyone eventually moved toward wider power bands and higher torque rise. They had no choice. Fleets were buying Macks because the drivers could actually drive them without a PhD in gear selection. And for Mack, the Maxidyne was a commercial lifeline. With Hansen's leadership and the Maxidyne as their flagship product, Mack became the go-to truck from the mid-60s through the 80s. Fleet rosters filled up with R-model Macks, running Maxidynes behind 5-speed Maxitorques. The scrapyards are full of those transmissions, by the way, not because they broke, because the trucks around them wore out first. Old Mack guys love to point out that the triple countershaft Maxitorque was so overbuilt, so fundamentally indestructible, that hardly anybody ever managed to kill one. The twin stick didn't die in a day. It took years. Through the 70s and into the 80s, plenty of trucks still rolled with 2 levers on the floor. Old-school drivers who'd spent decades mastering the art weren't about to give it up, because some engineer in Maryland thought they should shift less. There was pride in that skill. Identity. The twin stick was a gatekeeper. If you could drive one, you were a real trucker. If you couldn't, you found another line of work. These were the guys who could diagnose a transmission problem by sound alone, who knew exactly when to downshift for a grade without looking at a gauge, who understood the relationship between gear selection and fuel economy not from a manual, but from 10,000 miles of doing it wrong first. But economics don't care about pride. Fleet managers cared about training costs. They cared about transmission repairs from missed shifts. They cared about driver fatigue and accident rates. A 5-speed Mack that any competent driver could operate meant lower insurance, faster training, less damage, and more hours on the road. A driver who could be productive after a few weeks of training instead of months. The math was merciless, and the math always wins. By the mid-1980s, Mack had tweaked the Maxidyne formula again. Fleet operators complained that running the engine up to 2,100 revolutions per minute was burning too much fuel. So Mack lowered the governed speed to 1,800, tightening the power band to 600 revolutions per minute. That engine essentially became the blueprint for every modern heavy-duty diesel. Low-speed torque. Flat power curve. Enough range for a simple transmission. Then they went even further, dropping to a 1,000 to 1,800 revolutions per minute band, so drivers could still use a 5-speed and barely touch the lever all day. The industry followed. Single-lever transmissions replaced twin sticks through the 80s and 90s. Then in the 2000s, automated manuals started their takeover. By 2010, a quarter of new trucks had them. By 2017, it was roughly half. Today, about 80% of new Class 8 trucks roll off the line with automated manual transmissions. Push a button, select drive, steer. The twin stick is functionally extinct in commercial trucking. You can still find them in collector rigs and owner-operator show trucks. There are guys on YouTube running 5x4s behind 3 408 cats, both hands working the levers. And it's a beautiful thing to watch, an art form. But it's an art form that was made obsolete by an engine that came out of a nearly bankrupt truck company in 1966. The story doesn't end happily for everyone, though. Hansen's reforms and the Maxidyne saved Mack. By the early 1970s, sales hit $1 billion for the first time. Allentown became known as the truck capital of the world. The company dedicated its new world headquarters to Hansen in 1972. A year later, in a gesture that tells you everything about the man, he rededicated the building in honor of all Mack employees. But the company's fundamental problem, chronic cash starvation, never fully went away. Signal Oil and Gas bought Mack in 1967, providing some capital but also some corporate meddling. Hansen retired in 1974 at 65, following company policy. He was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame. He died in 1990 in Sebring, Florida, at 81. The day after his death, Mack announced a new CEO from Renault. The timing was almost poetic. By the 80s, Mack was struggling again. The Maxidyne was still selling, still dominant in vocational applications. Dump trucks, concrete mixers, heavy haul. But highway trucking was shifting. Cummins, Detroit Diesel, and Caterpillar were pushing 400 horsepower and above. Mack responded with the E9 V8, 998 cubic inches, ratings up to 500 horsepower, and that engine was a legend in its own right, among loggers and heavy haulers in Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest. But the financial bleeding continued. Renault bought in during 1983. By 2000, Volvo owned the whole thing, paid $1.71 billion in shares for Mack and Renault's truck division combined. Winton Pelizzoni retired from Mack in 1978 after more than 4 decades with the company. He'd risen from test cell engineer to vice president of engineering and product development. Even in retirement, he kept working. He consulted for Mack, for the Penske IndyCar's racing team, and for other firms. He was still inventing when he died in March of 2011 at the age of 97. He'd been working on a new clutch design at 97. A man who had been building engines since the 1930s, who held more patents for internal combustion engines than most companies, was still sketching new ideas in his final years. His family said he left behind works in progress. His colleagues called him the closest thing Mack ever had to a Thomas Edison. A soft-spoken man from Allentown, Pennsylvania, who held more internal combustion engine patents than most people knew existed and who fundamentally changed how every heavy truck on the planet makes power. Today, every modern diesel truck engine uses the basic architecture that Pelizzoni defined. Low-speed torque, wide power band, fewer gears. The Maxidyne concept is so universal now that nobody even calls it a concept anymore. It's just how engines work. The entire industry absorbed his innovation so completely that most people in trucking have never heard his name. That's the dark part of this story. Not that the twin stick died. Progress kills things. That's what progress does. The dark part is what was lost in the transaction. A generation of drivers who could diagnose a transmission by sound, who could feel a shift point through the seat of their pants, who understood the relationship between engine speed and gear ratio, not because someone taught them in a classroom, but because the truck would punish them if they didn't. That mechanical literacy is gone. The barrier to entry that kept uncommitted drivers out of the profession is gone. The pride that came from mastering something genuinely difficult is gone. There's a FreightWaves article from a few years back that asked the question directly. When we eliminated trucking's natural mechanical barrier to entry, did we fundamentally change who gets behind the wheel? The old-timers will tell you yes. The learning process itself used to teach drivers about their trucks in ways that no classroom instruction could match. Understanding how to float gears meant grasping the relationship between engine RPM and transmission input shaft speed. Learning to downshift properly meant understanding engine braking, weight distribution, and the physics of momentum. These weren't abstract concepts, they were immediate. Get it wrong and you heard it, felt it, paid for it in grinding metal and lost time. The commitment required to master the twin stick meant drivers were more likely to stay in the industry. There was a sunk cost in skill that created loyalty and professional identity. You didn't just have a job, you had a craft. And that craft started dying the day Winton Pelizzoni figured out how to make an engine that didn't need it. The Maxidyne made trucking easier, it made it more efficient, it made it safer, and it erased a skill set that took a lifetime to build. So the next time you see an 18-wheeler roll past on the interstate, quiet cab, automatic transmission, climate control, think about what it used to take. 2 levers, both hands, both feet. And an engine that fought you every mile. The Mack Maxidyne ended that fight. Whether that was a mercy or a loss depends on who you ask. And there you have it. The engine that killed the twin stick. If you drove a twin stick, or your father did, or you just think transmissions shouldn't shift themselves, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.